There'll Never Be a Story of Forgiveness by Thomas DeBarge, Chapter 7, last but not least, Big Brother Bobby. Bobby was the oldest male of the DeBarge children and the brother with whom I spent the most time. We were a year apart in age, though he seemed so much older. A savage mixture of confusion and pride, he reigned from a throne of domination. His pain was a lighthouse, guiding him directly into dangerous areas of no return. His emotional responses were like violent waves that exceeded the boundaries of the sea. I saved him as the last of my siblings to speak on because he had the greatest influence on my life. As boys, I remember my brother to be dissatisfied with everyone and everything around him, especially me. He didn't like my outgoing personality. Having been hurt by people, he called me stupid for my desire to be close to others. I couldn't help myself. I wanted friends. That was a big difference between him and me. When I got beat, I'd eventually get back to being just a boy who loved boy things. Bobby never seemed to get over any of the chastisements. While I reached out to connect with others, he withdrew like a turtle into his shell. He didn't want to need anyone. If I wanted to be around Bobby, I had to do what he wanted to do. If I tried to rise up against his supremacy by expressing my own thoughts, he didn't want me around. He felt he had to be in control of everything, probably to keep the hurt bolted outside the door. I made a lot of compromises just to be in my big brother's life. To be honest, for a long time, I didn't think Bobby cared about me. He was so angry all the time. I tried really hard to be accepted by him. The harder I worked to get his approval, the harder he shoved me away with ridicule. He, like Bunny, didn't seem to care that I needed him. He was caught up in his own cynicism, which paced freely up and down the corridors of his mind. For the most part, I understood Bobby's hardness. The same bad thoughts that lurked in the darkened chambers of his mind made sporadic appearances in mine as well. We'd both been hurt pretty badly by someone we loved. It was this misconstrued mental state that he attempted to love me and others. The result was pretty disastrous. Bobby had a terrible temper. He was an explosive bomb set to go off at any given moment. His anger made it seem like he was a mean person, but deep inside, he couldn't have been because God doesn't create anyone mean. Life makes us mean, if we let it. Bobby's thoughts were usually far away from the moment, trying to figure things out and attempting to understand why such a natural thing as love had become such a miserable topic in his mind. I had no answers for my brother and learned that the greatest assistance I could be to him was simply to accept him in whatever state he presented himself. Bobby paraded around like he knew he was important and powerful. On the inside, though, he felt insignificant. He lacked the all-important source of love from Daddy. He lived each day of his life in revenge of that particular void. I never held a grudge towards Bobby, no matter how badly he treated me. I was forgiving like that, like he hadn't done anything at all to offend me. I saw him through the eyes of value in the same manner in which I felt Elle looked upon me. No matter what Bobby did, I loved him unconditionally. Bobby's smile was pleasant yet rarely seen. We had fun playing with toy cars together until he'd hear Daddy's voice. As soon as he'd hear Daddy come through the front door, his whole countenance would change. He would pull away quickly from our playtime and sit nervously in the corner, biting his nails, rocking, shaking his head, waiting for Daddy's daily dose of disapproval. When I felt he'd sat there long enough, I would question when we could resume playing. In an angry voice, he would quiet me so he could listen for Daddy's footsteps. I watched him go through this every day when Daddy came home from work. Bobby feared Daddy like the victim feared the bad guy in a horror movie. Daddy always without fail found something to be angry with him about. I learned to sit with Bobby in silence, waiting expectantly for the unexpected. Like clockwork, the bedroom door would swing open, the harsh accusations would come, and Daddy would start swinging on Bobby. Bobby's tears were usually the aftermath of a beating. He surprised me on one occasion when he proved to be capable of crying about something other than that. It was during a period of time when Daddy and Mama had split up and reunited again. Things between them hadn't changed clearly. They were still fighting. One Sunday morning, as we were getting ready for church, Mom and Daddy got into a brawl. Fearful of the outcome, Bunny telephoned Uncle Norman, Mama's brother, who was known to be a fighting man. He had big, impressive muscles, and he wore a patch over his left eye. He was fed up with our family matters. He came over right away to stop Daddy from beating Mama. We were living on the corner of Thomas and Fuller at the time, a busy intersection in Grand Rapids, and Mama was pregnant with the twins. As Daddy was laying down his law, Uncle Norman stormed into the house. "Where is he?" he demanded in search of Daddy as he moved quickly up the stairs. Without asking Daddy any questions, Uncle Norman hit him with blows to his face and body that were brutal. I stood in the living room with my brothers and sister. I noticed plaster crumbling from the ceiling as Daddy hit the floor. I rushed upstairs with my siblings to see the fight. To begin with, I joined in with cheers for Uncle Norman, then all at once my support along with the rest of us kids turned into pleadings for him to stop. Uncle Norman was hurting Daddy. I knew what it was like to feel that type of pain. Despite the harm Daddy inflicted upon me, he was still my father. I personally didn't want him to suffer in such a manner. Bobby begged along with the rest of us for Uncle Norman to stop the beating. Regardless, Uncle Norman didn't relent. He kept on hitting Daddy. Neighbors heard the disturbance. The brutality that previously took place in our home for so many years suddenly lay exposed for all to see that Sunday morning. The police arrived to find a big black man standing over a bloodied white man. They assessed the situation and were ready to arrest Uncle Norman. Daddy assured the officers it was a family matter and refused to press charges. My heart was saddened as I gazed at Daddy slumped down on the floor. I forgot about his abuse momentarily. His body was bruised, his face was swollen, and his undershirt was covered with blood. I wondered if he was hurt on the inside too, the same way I felt after he would beat me. Uncle Norman had stripped Daddy of everything, his pride, his warrior status, and even the pistol he kept in the house. There lay the lion I feared. He was helpless and speechless. His humanity was exposed for his kids to see that he really was a human being. In my mind, he had bore a fairy tale legend of being much larger and more powerful than any other human being. That day, Uncle Norman proved to Daddy that he wasn't the unstoppable beast he thought himself to be when matched against another man instead of a woman and children. Compassion was part of Bobby's character that day. It took such a brutal situation to stir his seared emotions. I saw my brother cry a different batch of tears. In spite of Daddy's actions, Bobby did still care about him. Knowing that was like a ray of hope for me in the midst of our predicament. I had believed that Bobby's heart was totally darkened before that evidence was revealed. Bobby withdrew more and more the older we got. He was past the tolerance of abuse by the time he reached adolescence. Without proper structure in our home, he was able to act upon whatever he set his heart to. His mind was morally corrupt at that point. He traded off being the abused to becoming the abuser. We had moved from Detroit to Grand Rapids, Michigan when I was 12 and Bobby was 13. Daddy was out of the home more than he was in, which enabled Bobby to walk in bold contempt against Mama's authority. A strong spirit of pride controlled him. Nobody was going to tell him what to do. My behavior continued to be mischievous, whereas Bobby's was malicious. It seemed all he cared about was what pleased Bobby. He didn't care if he injured others as long as he felt recompense for the harm that had been done to him. I watched my brother give up on religion. He rationalized that God had the power to prevent the horrible things that had happened in his past but had chosen not to, and for that Bobby was angry and refused to serve him. He also abandoned hope of anything good being made of family relations. He despised Daddy and had some hard feelings against Mama as well. I refused to believe that my big brother could completely let go of God. I allowed myself to hope that he somehow had retained a small portion of faith. I became doubtful, though, when abnormal affections manifested, which I knew to be the end result of someone who had turned their back on God altogether. It was during that period of time that my brother Bobby began to sexually abuse me. Bobby and I had always shared a room together. We used to lie in our separate beds at night and talk before drifting off to sleep. We spoke of the day's events, made fun of our cousins. Bobby spoke of his future dreams, and of course, he complained. I'd usually drift off to sleep before our talks ended. It was my favorite time spent with my brother. I had taken a bath one particular evening and entered our bedroom. There was no curtain on the window, which allowed illumination from the street lights outdoors. By the dim light, I saw the form of Bobby's body under the covers. He had his blanket pulled all the way over him up to his chin. It was unusual to see him lying in what I considered to be an odd position and to be covered in such a manner. The atmosphere was just weird. He was quiet that night, whereas usually he was singing or talking or something. I moved quickly to dry off, put on my pajamas, and get into my own bed. He looked at my body in a peculiar way. Before I was able to ask him what was wrong, he asked, "Do you want to jack off?" We used that term foolishly as kids, but I didn't know the true meaning of what masturbation was. He proceeded to explain to me without painting the full picture. He didn't tell me it was a form of sexual sin or that I could become enslaved by it. He told me it would feel good and that it would help me relieve stress. He told me there was nothing wrong with it. I was still a boy in my mind, catching frogs and throwing dirt. Sex hadn't yet entered my realm of thinking. I did recall hearing at church that it wasn't permitted before marriage. It seemed as though Bobby knew what I was thinking as he began to rationalize that masturbation wasn't sex. When he put it like that, my mind agreed with him that I hadn't heard specifically that there was anything wrong with masturbation. So I agreed, and he showed me how. Bobby's mind was devious. We were in our own separate beds initially, and then he came over to mine. He moved uncomfortably close to me, and then asked an unsettling question. Can I put it in? I was confused by what he meant. I was inexperienced with natural intercourse with a female, not to mention unnatural relations with a male. No, I demanded. He laughingly explained how men came together in that manner, and I held firm to my answer. No. I wondered where and how and when my brother had attained such vile knowledge. Bobby never took no for an answer. He was strong, and he held me down as he forced his way on me, then in me. Oh my God, what was he doing to me? I tried to alter the situation in my mind in order to think this wasn't happening, but there was nowhere for my thoughts to run to. Afterward, I was overtaken with shame, and I feared him even more than before. There was no way around what had happened. My brother had raped me, and the only person I would have run to protection from this terrible act was the one who had done it to me. I was so scared when I awoke the next morning, with that being the first thing on my mind. When my eyes met with Bobby's in the kitchen, he quickly turned away. He couldn't face me at all that day. My mind reasoned that Mama would find some fault of my own in the matter and that she would condemn me for what Bobby had done. So I didn't tell her. There was no thought of telling Daddy because I simply didn't have a problem-solving type relationship with him. What I feared most was my brother hating me if I told on him. He was already isolated from me as much as I could barely stand. I knew he would completely abandon me if I exposed him in this wrong. I was hurt once again, both physically and emotionally, and this time I was really alone. I didn't know what to do. Bobby had always teased me, but he scorned me like never before in front of our friends and cousins that first day after he had molested me. Mama's words never hurt like Bobby's new vocabulary towards me, nor did Daddy's beatings feel so bad. He didn't say anything about what had happened the night before, but suddenly began belittling me beyond measure in front of everyone, whereas it used to be he'd only talk cruelly to me around our family. He said I was a dummy and that I had a big head, and he called me a sissy. He mocked everything I said and made fun of everything I did. Everyone laughed at me. I couldn't respond because I felt so humiliated inside, so I just walked away. I had been my big brother's companion and suffering through our childhood abuse from Daddy. Adolescence brought on a new dimension of our relationship that was disgusting. Molestation tore down the brotherly boundary between him and me as far as I was concerned. He hadn't often told me he loved me before, but he suddenly began telling me. That must have been part of his acceptance of what he was doing. That love was somehow involved. I found no love at all in his acts. Being molested became a great ball and chain to my will, like I was a willing participant. Everything I thought myself to be was suddenly attached to what he did. His words built their own private storage room in the front of my imagination. All I could see was the immorality he'd brought into my life that I now had to deal with. I held in what happened, which enabled Bobby to continue the abuse. He found words and ways to trick me into his unnatural sexual enjoyment on a regular basis. I hated going to bed at night. I took on the guilt and shame, seeing his degrading acts as my fault instead of his. I had already perceived myself to be unlovable based on Daddy's words and actions towards me. Being molested by my own big brother made me feel less than human. From that first horrible evening forward, he refused to allow me to hang out with him publicly until several years later. I continued to be the focus of his perversion at night nonetheless. Bobby used me and then hated me for allowing myself to be used. He got angry whenever he saw me, since I was a mirror he looked into only to find his vice, his failure, his wickedness, and his dishonor. I hated to look at myself too for the same reasons. He was very cold towards me during our teenage years. Part of Bobby remained compelled to be a big brother, just like Bunny. He still protected me when our peers tried to harm me. He didn't allow his personal dislike of me to affect his job as my guard. With that, I felt perhaps he'd forgiven me and I could come back into his circle of acceptance. I was wrong. He still didn't want me around him. He looked out for me while he was the one doing the most damage. I guess that was just the crazy way our family thought. I can abuse and mistreat you, but nobody else can. When we got separate rooms, I was sure the sexual abuse would finally come to an end. I was wrong again. Bobby would then sneak into my room late at night. I would hear him coming, having learned from him to listen quickly for impending danger, and I'd make attempts at pretending to be asleep. Bobby was never fooled. Sometimes I retaliated with anger, but he would manipulate me into allowing him to molest me by but he would manipulate me into allowing him to molest me by telling me he would make advances towards another brother if I didn't participate. The thought of him sodomizing one of my younger brothers terrified me. For that reason, I gave in. Surrendering my own body was my false understanding of protecting the other boys. I felt stupid for not having the courage to tell on him. The same fear that paralyzed me when Daddy hit me kept me from moving in any direction when it came to Bobby. I hoped for a natural way out, such as him getting caught, but Bobby was shrewd. He never gave anyone any reason to suspect him. It was the abuse and the bitterness that influenced my brother's decisions, I suppose. His lack of respect for God drew right and wrong to a place of extreme liberality. The absence of love while growing up meant there were no guidelines when it came to acting upon sensual pleasures. None of us kids had been taught obedience, we'd been taught to fear. Going over the possible reasons why he did those things to me didn't wash away the tremendous suffering his wrong had caused me. I spent much of my life aimlessly wandering in immoral wounds of my mind where his actions had opened doors, wondering whether I was supposed to be gay or straight and why I was such a coward, as well as confusing sex acts with love. His demons became mine. I had to deal with monstrous forms of perversion as I matured into a young man because he opened a grave that should have never had the dirt removed from it. Bobby abused me sexually until I was 15. I never ceased loving my brother through all of that, nor did I speak negatively of him to others. In my perception, he was still Bobby, my big brother, and I continued to hold him in high regard. I prayed his attitude toward me would change one day so that he could love me purely and accept me as I'd accepted him.